Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony DeBolfo. I'm the CEO of the Old Paradians Association, and on behalf of the OPA, I'd like to welcome you all to this morning's webinar with Steve Fahey, a registered psychologist and a final year student of Parade's class of 1979. I'd just like to advise that a total of 55 confirmations have been received for this morning's webinar. Amongst them, Mary Duras, Parade College's Assistant Principal, Staff Wellbeing and Development, current teachers, past students, parents and friends of the Old Paradians Association. Before I introduce this morning's guest speaker, I've been asked by Kylie Hannam to remind you all to kindly mute your screens. And if you have a question for Steve, please type it out in the little chat bar at the bottom of your screen, and he'll endeavour to answer your question at session's end. As you would have read in the flyer, Steve was previously involved with the corporate and tertiary education sectors and has been a registered psychologist since 2004. He's worked as a counsellor in community and family therapy agencies and provided coaching and counselling to employees. In recent years, he's availed a broad range of psychological services, prevention, early intervention and crisis intervention, to emergency service workers, as well as providing consultation and coaching to managers. As we're all dealing with challenges we've never experienced before, we're most fortunate that Steve has offered his precious time this morning to advise how we can all find fulfilling and healthy lives when the circumstances in which we find ourselves are so odd, worrying and restrictive. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Steve to the webinar. Good morning, Stephen.
Yeah, good morning, Tony, and good morning to everyone on the screen there in Zoom land, one of our favourite destinations during this very strange times in which we live.
Steve, could I first start by asking you to talk a little bit about your journey? I mean, you weren't always a psychologist. When you left school, you embarked on other vocations in your life. How did you arrive at this point?
Sure. Well, it's definitely a long and winding road, Tony. I think I'll probably give you the sort of relatively short form version of that. So I didn't start studying psychology till I was in my early 30s. As you said, when I left school, I went and worked at a bank, and I also studied commerce part-time at uni, and I had a fairly spectacularly unsuccessful first stint at uni, where I just didn't sort of really know why I was there, and I was going at night, and you know, my friends at 18 and 19 were out having fun, and I didn't really show any commitment or passion for the studies, and I dropped out. I worked in a bank, and in my mid-20s I worked in the financial markets with that bank, and I had a manager that really strongly encouraged me to go back to my studies. I went back to uni, did an economics and finance degree, which was great. I guess, and that was all part-time. In my late 20s, I sort of was a bit lost and directionless. I drifted. I hadn't really sort of been clear about what was important or what my real sort of direction or focus was. One of the things I did, I went and saw a therapist. I happened to see a really fantastic therapist, and it was very helpful to me personal level, but it also really sort of sparked my interest. And I'd always been sort of very curious and interested in human behaviour, and I sort of investigated a few of the different allied health professions, and in my early 30s started studying psychology, like I was part-time again while I was working. I was doing some teaching at some unis, and I didn't finish my studies in psychology till my late 30s, and I've been doing this for the last 20 years or so.
So Steve, as you can appreciate, when I introduced you, we've had a number of people commit to this morning's webinar. And as I said, we're all feeling this extraordinary experience, the time that we're living in. There's still no vaccine, Steve. There's still no magic wand. Do you have a blueprint for how we all should be dealing with this thing called the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure. It's a really good question you asked, Tony, and I think that word, there's no magic wand, or that phrase, there's no magic wand, has been repeated many times, and I'll probably repeat it a couple of times today. I guess what I hope to offer in the session today is some general mental health principles. I guess it's really important to put a couple of caveats on that, in terms of, we are talking about general mental health principles. I'm not giving, obviously offering individual advice to people. You should see your GP or your mental health professional for that. And the discussion today, we're talking about adult mental health. I don't specialise in children's or adolescents. I'm aware that there's probably some people here who are naturally concerned about their kids' well-being. Some of the general principles would apply, but there'd be some differences. So, look, I guess, some of the things we're seeing in the community, and this won't be a surprise to anyone who's attending the webinar, is that we're seeing a sort of a surge in the collective anxiety. There's this thing that none of us could foresee, or there might have been a very small number of epidemiologists who might have seen that it was a possibility, but it's sort of felt like there's a whole lot of stuff that's been completely out of our control. So we've seen some, collective anxiety, and I think it's important and a lot of distress, and it's important to acknowledge that this is a really normal reaction to what's going on around us. Lots of people have had their lives sort of tipped on their heads. Obviously, we've had people lose their lives or significantly, lose their health, as well as their work, their social contact, through the various restrictions and lockdowns. And I guess, as we said, some of the things that have seemed outside of our control are obviously the virus itself. We've also seen things like, I guess, the actions of the various governments are outside our control. I mean, we might agree with some things, we might disagree with other things, but either way, they're not within our control. And of course, one of the other things that we can't control is other people's actions. We've heard probably a lot, particularly during stage 4 of lockdown, of how frustrated and annoying it is when we go out and we see people not wearing masks, or not wearing masks properly, or flouting other laws. And again, we've got very limited control over that. So there's this sort of sense of anxiety and angst, and that there's a loss of control of a lot of the things, parts of our world. I guess some of the impacts we've seen on that and individuals and collectively is increased anxiety, increased irritability, increased impatience, boredom, helplessness, hopelessness. We've seen a big increase in sleep disruptions and changes. We've seen a significant increase in the rate of drinking. We've seen less product, I guess most people who are working would say they've been less productive during this period. We've seen an increase in family violence. We've seen a massive increase in calls to places like Lifeline and the Beyond Blue sort of COVID helpline. And I guess it's really worth pointing out that, the impacts of this pandemic have been very different across, people. As we said, we've had many people who have, been unfortunate enough to catch the virus, but obviously people who have died, people who have had loved ones die, people who have lost work, people who are living alone at the moment, who are, because of force of the government regulations, are very limited in their social contact. And we've had other people who have been less impacted, who've been able to maintain their work, maybe, living in circumstances where they've got a family or a household full of people who they're connected to. So we've seen this sort of enormous variation in impact. I think the other point that I'd note is that I guess we've also heard stories about people having some positive impacts through this period of significant disruption and change to our lifestyle. People reporting increased connection with loved ones, enjoying the simple things, enjoying not having a lot of external commitments, and not having kids running around to, sport training every night and sport on the weekend, and being able to spend a bit more time with people. And I see a few people nodding on the screen there. So there's been a lot of swings and roundabouts, and I guess there's been, lots of negative impacts, and there's also been some positive impacts. And for most of us, sorry, one of the joys of these things is my earplug just fell out, which is attached to my microphone. It's sometimes we feel we might be really cognizant or feeling these sort of positive impacts, and sometimes we might feel incredibly negative and helpless. Like, feelings come and go; they don't change. They don't stay forever. And I guess you know, some of these difficult feelings and experiences, the anxiety or the helplessness or the loneliness that people are feeling, I think it's really, you know, to use that term again, there is no magic wand for dealing with this from a psychological perspective. You know, I don't know any way, and I don't believe any psychologist or mental health professional knows any way of getting rid of painful thoughts and feelings permanently, okay? But what I do know, and what we'll talk about in the session today, is some ways of, you know, sort of experiencing those things and still finding a way of moving towards the people and the things that are important to you in your life. In other words, what we might call your values. So, like, I guess one of the starting principles, Tony, would be that, I guess, in any situation where there's big stuff going on, and like, not only have we had the pandemic, but obviously we started the year with the bushfires, and, you know, even in the last week in stage 4 lockdown, we've had this massive storm, which has left, you know, tens of thousands of households without power. Some of them still don't have power. And then, of course, we have people who lost their access, you know, they had to boil their water. And of course, some of those people without electricity were, you know, were also without, were meant to have water they'd boil. So we've had this enormous sort of accumulation. So I guess when things are really big and overwhelming, I think it's really important that we acknowledge our fears, we acknowledge our difficult feelings and concerns, and normalise the fact that sometimes we do feel overwhelmed. And then we also try to be really present in what's happening right now and break it down into the smallest possible steps that we can make, and even break it down small. So as a really sort of concrete example of that, Tony, I'm guessing there's some people who are attending this webinar now that, you know, when they realised, when they either got a phone reminder or some sort of reminder this morning, or they remembered that this webinar was on, that maybe you've experienced some thoughts that I'm too busy, I can't be bothered, I've got other things to do, maybe it won't be useful, maybe it won't, you know, I've found psychologists not to be that helpful, and I've heard them before. Lots of sort of thoughts, and some people, and I'm guessing, as I said, that at least some of the people on the screen that I can see in front of me will have had those thoughts and have still made the choice to be here right now. They're focused on that very small step in that moment to think, yeah, maybe I do feel busy, maybe there's other stuff to do, maybe I don't really feel like don't feel motivated and bothered, and I can have still made the choice to be here. Equally, there might be some people who had those thoughts show up this morning and didn't attend the webinar, and maybe because they did have other commitments and that were more important, or they were too busy, or sort of maybe sometimes we sort of get pushed around by our mind and by our difficult feelings that sometimes takes us away from doing the things that might be important, or that you know, might be of benefit to us. And if we again break that down into, you know, again, making a choice sort of right now in this moment right now, I guess every person at this webinar has got a choice in terms of how you want to be in terms of being present at this webinar. You know, I guess we can be really present and engaged and really open to ideas or discussion. And for all of us, there's probably every single person in this webinar has probably been to a webinar or a Zoom meeting during this pandemic. And we've also been on eBay flicking through, you know, things to buy, or we've been on the AFL website looking at whether the match review panels has come up with something for Toby Green yet, or something else. In other words, we've been a bit less than present. We've been a bit distracted. So I guess we're trying to break it down into, in a world where lots of things seem big and out of control, often bring it back to being very present in the moment and making choices about what's important right now, right in this minute. I can't control the pandemic. I can't control the government action. I can't control what others do. But right now, I can control what I do. I can control in the moment how I treat myself, how I treat other people, how I treat my body, what I want to put in my body, what I don't want to put in my body in terms of some of those things around, you know, diet, exercise, alcohol, lifestyle things.
Steve, it's very interesting, as you said, you alluded to the people on the screen that we can see at the moment, and it's fabulous to see everyone this morning. It's really interesting to note that I think we have a member of the constabulary joining us as well, and one of the men who are on essential service doing a great job for the community in extremely difficult times. We all are experiencing different responses because of the different stages of our lives and our walks of life and so forth. So I can only speak for myself. And one of the things I think I've found through the course of this pandemic is a real sense of claustrophobia. You know, I feel that the walls are almost coming in on me. I'm not working in essential services, so spending a lot of time at home. And just to give an example of what it actually does to you, last Friday I had to, for work, I had to get a permit to drive beyond the 5 kilometre radius where we're all cocooned at the moment. And I had to drive Preston to Moonee Ponds, and that was probably the longest drive I've had in probably 12 weeks. And it was the most liberating feeling to actually just drive that little bit further out of the, the 5 kilometre bubble. So it's really, really amazing to think of what this sort of experience does to the psyche. So, a lot of us are trapped. You know, that is the bottom line. A lot of us are trapped. How do we best deal with that sort of problem? You know, the issue of claustrophobia and the feeling that you're actually in.
Sure. Well, it's an interesting point you raised, Tony, in terms of your drive from Preston to Moonee Ponds. It sounds like in the moment, in that drive, you were right in that moment. You weren't caught up in fears about what's going to happen in a week or a year's or a month or a year's time, or what had happened yesterday or the day before. You were just really in that moment and aware of the fact that you'd sort of expanded your awareness from this sort of, room that you're sitting in now, that most of us have been spending a lot of times in our homes. And so I guess there's something there about, one, acknowledging that we are subject to restrictions. None of us are more special than anyone else. They apply to all of us, and that does pose some challenges, and acknowledging the challenges that does impose and that we face. And the other thing, there's something there about sort of that capacity that you talked about, and sort of getting out of your head a bit, getting out of this sort of story about I'm trapped, I'm stuck. I'm stuck. There's some elements of truth to that in terms of the restrictions that we can't move out of the 5K zones. But I guess, again, trying to take up that point about making choices in the moment, I guess, we can all make the most of the space that we're in for a starter. Like, as I said to you before we came on screen with everyone, like I'm sitting here near an open window with the sun sort of pouring in on me. When we chatted Friday afternoon, to do the sort of final planning for this session, I was working out in the backyard in the sun on the computer, and I had the liberty to be able to do that because I was doing some admin things. So like small things like that can, we've got to focus on when the big stuff's sort of outside of our control and sometimes, not to our favor. We've got to keep coming back to what are the things that we can do? What are the choices we can make right now? I think, it's a great point that you make, and that moment, that sense of being really present. I think in terms of, I think maybe we can talk a bit about those sort of what we might call those lifestyle behaviours, Tony, things like exercise, healthy eating, sleep habits, alcohol consumption, social connection, and interests and passions. But I guess, I'm guessing everyone on the screen here has got basic or more advanced knowledge of knowing what the sort of general guidelines are around healthy diet or exercise or social, that social connection is good for us. But again, there's some things that get in the way of us doing those things. It's not so much information that we're lacking. It's that we get sort of caught up or sort of hooked up in these thoughts. If I'm using this sort of metaphor of your hands as your thoughts, I can't be bothered. What's the point? If I can't go, out farther than 5Ks, why go at all? If I can't ride my bike and move outside the 5K zone, I don't want, why would I bother at all? And sort of when we get hooked up in things, our choices in our world really sort of narrows and narrows. So what we're trying to do is be really clear about, well, what's important about those things. And as you experienced on that drive from Moonee Ponds to Preston, just noting that, well, okay, so when I do this, actually my energy is different. Things sort of open up a bit. So how can I find ways of doing that, small bits of that more often, more regularly? Not so much going out the 5K zone, but, if you're fortunate enough to have a backyard, and the sun's shining, can you make that phone call to family members? Can you read that book? Can you listen to that radio show or that podcast? Can you do it outside? Can you take your computer outside if you're working? And, just sort of change your environment, get some vitamin D, expand that awareness and sort of acknowledge the stuff that's going on in our heads and the feeling, but also sort of expand that and connect with other people and the world a bit more. Because it's a big challenge, as you point out, Tony.
Very true. Steve, you mentioned in a conversation I think we had late last week about the what you call was the concept of dropping the anchor.
Yeah.
Do you talk a little bit about that and explain what you meant by that, and so the viewers get a bit of an understanding of the concept?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think we might talk about it for a couple of minutes, and then we might actually invite people to do it, Tony. Which is, I guess what we're talking about when we're talking about how we make room for these thoughts and feelings and that can get in the way of us doing these behaviours that connect us with ourselves and others and the world. I guess we're talking about developing psychological skills there, and I guess developing the psychological skills that we use and that we can develop. The same principles apply to hitting a ball or playing an instrument. In that small amounts of regular practice, okay, generally develop and hone our skills. And this skill that you're talking about, the dropping an anchor, I guess the metaphor might be that, I'm not a nautical person, Tony, but, boats can sometimes get caught in storms. And the metaphor is the storms are sometimes our very strong emotions and thoughts. And we can get sort of pushed around or buffeted by them a bit like a boat in a storm. And I guess the metaphor continues around the fact that, if you're in a boat and a storm blows in, you can't make the storm go away. You can't control the storm. Okay, the storm's an external factor. You've got no control over that. Of course, if you can get to a port or a shore, you would. But that's often not going to be possible. And so, as we said, you can't control the storm, but what you can do is sort of drop a bit of an anchor to steady yourself and sort of ride through the storm and focus again on what's in your control. So, as we said, what we might do is invite people. We'll do this at a bit of an experiential exercise and invite everyone to participate. And of course, if you prefer not to participate, that's absolutely fine. It'll run for a few minutes, and I'll guide you through it. And I'll also be sending Tony and Kylie some links to some resources at the end of the session, including a link to that if you want to be able to use and practice this skill, that there'll be a way of link to some audio and YouTube clips on that. So what I'm going to ask everyone to do is just, whether you're sitting or whether you're standing, just sort of get yourself nice and upright and comfortable in your chair, but actually just make a choice about how you sit, and just even notice as you get yourself a bit upright and you make that adjustment, just notice whether there's any change to how your body feels and the energy from doing that. Sometimes we can be sort of slumped and sitting in our chair, and the energy can be a bit like that as well. And what I'm going to ask you is just to notice any sensations that you feel in your head. Just using them, and just note them to yourself using the label. So I'm noticing a little bit of tension in my jaw. Okay. I'm noticing my mouth's a bit dry. I probably need to have a drink. Okay. And then moving down from our head to our shoulders, and our arms, our chest and stomach. Just noticing whatever sensations are showing up in the body, in the upper back and the lower back, and the hips, the upper legs, the lower legs, the feet. Again, just noticing, and I'm noticing whatever sensation. So I'm noticing that my feet in contact with the floor. And just as you sit quietly, just noticing and naming any feelings or emotions that are showing up for you right now. So I'm noticing some curiosity for me. I'm noticing a tiny bit of anxiety. I'm noticing a focus. I'm very focused. And noticing any thoughts that are showing up for you now. And for some people, there might be some difficult or challenging thoughts. This exercise might be uncomfortable right in this moment. And if there's any challenging or difficult or uncomfortable thoughts or feelings, just sort of acknowledge that, oh, there's some difficult stuff here. Okay. And then what I'm also going to ask you to do is, whether you're sitting or standing, just press your feet into the floor and just really feel those points of contact as you do that. Okay. So really feeling the points of contact between your feet and the floor, and then relaxing. And then doing it again and a bit harder and holding it and just noticing the muscles in the upper leg activate, muscles in the lower leg activate. And taking your hands together, and again, just we're going to ask people to just sort of stretch your arms out in front, but before you do that and as you do that, just move within your range of what's comfortable with whatever body restrictions or injuries or limitations you've got. But just really sort of stretching your arms out in front of you, and if it feels okay and comfortable, to get them above you and around. You might like to roll your shoulders again if that feels okay for you. Move your head from side to side. You might want to give your arms a bit of a rub and a bit of a pat if you want to. Again, choosing what you do, and okay. And then again, just noticing what thoughts and feelings are showing up for you, and just using that label. I'm noticing, naming them and acknowledging them. Just okay. And then I'm going to invite you to, in the room that you're currently in, just to have a quick look around the room, just to name. I'm noticing any three objects. So I'm noticing a printer. I'm noticing a poster on the wall. I'm noticing my phone. And just noticing and naming three things that you can see in the immediate environment. And then noticing and naming any two sounds that you can hear. Again, using that short label, I'm noticing. And then coming back in your body and just stretching your body in whatever way you feel like stretching your body right now. And then if you've got an external window in the room that you're in, or you're outside, just sort of having a look in and seeing what's out there. Just again, noticing sort of what's out there. Okay. So what we've done in this exercise, we talked about Tony's experience in driving from Preston to Moonee Ponds, and sort of his awareness expanding and getting out of his head a bit, and some of the thoughts about being trapped. What we've done here is sort of done this expansive awareness exercise. The fancy term for this would be, this is a type of applied mindfulness exercise. Okay? You've probably all heard this term, mindfulness. I'll let you in on a secret. Mindfulness is a very fancy word for noticing. It simply means noticing in a particular way. And what we've done in this exercise, we've gone from these internal experiences of the thoughts and the feelings, and we've acknowledged them and noted that they're present. And you might have noted noticed that we noted them in a particular way. We simply labelled them very simply. What we didn't do is try to analyse them or judge them, say with whether we should be feeling them or give any commentary or try to understand why we're there. We're just naming and noticing them. And then we were moving into our body, okay? And then we're moving into the room, and then we're moving into the world. And we came back a couple of times and noticed any thoughts and feelings, okay? So if we go back to the sort of boat in the storm, if you like, we're just trying to sort of drop an anchor and steady ourselves when those emotions and feelings that are showing up are really strong and overwhelming and we're sort of feeling buffeted and pushed off direction. Because I guess coming back to your question, Tony, this is one of the longest winded answers ever, but coming back to your question around what do we do around that sort of feeling of being trapped, we notice that that's uncomfortable, okay? And then we notice that there's a whole lot of stuff like government regulations that we can't change at the moment. But what we can do is we've got control over our body, and we've got control, including our mouth. We've got control over what we do, what we say, what we don't do, what we put into our body. So again, we're trying to take this situation, which is quite large and overwhelming, and break it down into small steps that aren't some sort of hypothetical thing in the future, but are right now.
I found that it definitely worked for me, just even doing those small exercises, Steve, that I found that quite, sort of like a liberating sensation, actually, that just to, it helped, clear my head a little bit. And I think that, for me, has been one of the bigger issues to have to deal with in this. As I said earlier, the fact that the walls seem to be closing in, and it does sort of build this pressure that, that I hadn't been able to find a release valve for.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a really good point you make, Tony. It's difficult, and we're all prone to getting. I mean, I think all those thoughts and those feelings that you're describing, they're all normal and natural given what's going on in the world. And sometimes we get so sort of hooked up or caught up in the thoughts and the feelings that it sort of takes us away from sort of how we want to be in the world, maybe with our kids if we're parents, or maybe with our partners, or we can't be bothered exercising, or we drink more than we might normally or might ideally, because we sort of get caught up in these thoughts and feelings and don't have a way, of sort of being with them and finding ways to make choices towards those things. So look, I think if this is the first time you've ever done that exercise, it might have felt a bit odd or uncomfortable. That's quite possible. And I guess, sometimes when I work with clients for the first time, they say, Steve, that's all very well, but I'm no good at this. I was really crap at that exercise. I couldn't do it. And it was like, and the question I always ask him is, okay, so the first time you tried to kick a banana kick on your non-preferred foot, how did that go? Or the first time you played the guitar, how did that go? Okay, well, it felt awkward. I didn't know what I was doing, but as I practiced it, I found that I had some good days and some bad days, but the more I practiced, the more I developed a sort of base level of skill to build on and practice. And it became habit, that this capacity to sort of expand. And we're not trying to get rid of the thoughts and feelings, we're trying to acknowledge them, but we're also trying to find ways of not being pushed around by them, to still find ways of being how we want to be in the world, even though it's really difficult.
Steve, you've probably answered the question just through the course of that process you've taken us through on. The question that was put by Brendan Constein, who unfortunately had to leave the webinar, but he did ask what tools can be used in this restrictive environment to ensure that we all keep ourselves in a good mental space. Well, I think that what you've taken us through is probably as good as any in terms of helping that cause. But are there other ways of helping us keep that good mental space, as Brendan says?
Yeah, I think there's some terrific resources out there. One of the things that I'll send yourself and Kylie to forward on is both an ebook and a YouTube clip on a strategy called Face COVID, which is an acronym. And the face bit is actually the bit we've just done, which is focus on what you can control, acknowledge difficult thoughts and feelings, connect with your body, and engage in what matters and what's important. That's the first part of that, and that's a very good resource. The Beyond Blue have some excellent resources on their website. They have also, they're running a 24/7 COVID support line. There's some good resources there. I think those things are important. The other thing that I think that's really important, Tony, and obviously having attended a boys' school in the 1970s, as you and I did, that we're sometimes not very good at sharing our struggles with others. We will talk about the footy or whatever else is going on, but I think this capacity, it's a really from obviously what psychologists do is observe human behaviour and obviously try to help people make changes with behaviour. And it's an incredible time that we're living through, because I can't remember another time in our lifetimes where this thing is impacting everyone across the world in some way. So we're all experiencing some impacts in some ways or another. So I think one of the things that can be really important is just acknowledging that it's hard and that we're finding it difficult. And we know from all the research around mental health that, feeling that even if we've got really difficult feelings, when we tell someone else about them and when we hear that other people are experiencing similar things, we feel less alone in our experience. And that's a really critical thing, that we often think we're the only ones feeling this way. And we know that's a significant risk factor for mental health, and particularly for men. This thing that we sort of bottle up or don't share things. So, I think using the resources that are available through various organisations, but I think using your own resources and your own support networks is absolutely critical. Reaching out and being able to, I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago who said, I've cut myself off a bit because I'm not doing very much. So I don't feel like I've got much to say when I ring people. And I said to them, okay, I can understand that your world's sort of shrunk a bit, but when you ring someone and talk to them and you connect, what's it like? And they said, it's actually pretty good. I just feel sort of anxious about doing it because I don't feel like I've got much to sort of say or offer. And it's like, okay, so again, if we can make room for that discomfort and acknowledge it and still recognize and connect, what is it that's important about making this call? Well, human connection is good for all of us. And remind ourselves of when we've spoken to that person or other people that, generally that's a good experience and a connecting experience for us. And I guess one of the big challenges for all of us is we have to connect with other people in very different ways than we're used to.
Steve, I am married with family, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in similar situations to myself watching on this morning. But I'm equally aware there would be a lot of people watching on that perhaps living on their own, living in isolation. The issues that people in isolation have to deal with as opposed to people living with others are quite different, or are they different? Do the same principles apply to people that live in a collective in a confined space? The same as those who live alone?
I think the same principles apply, but I guess the context is very different. I guess, I'm similar to you. I've got family I'm living with, and, I guess the other situation, of course, that's really important is, there's some people living with family or in households which aren't particularly happy households, and, you don't have a lot of choice at the moment. So there's people who are living alone or in less happy households who their context is particularly challenging at the moment. I think the general principles and the general principles would still apply to them, but I think those people have to be, extra sort of resourceful in terms of connecting with other people, and if they're able to exercise and get out for that hour a day, even I think seeing other people sometimes can be get you out of your head a bit and getting out there. And I think the other side of that, for those of us that are fortunate enough to be, to have company on tap, if you so to speak, is to, be really aware that, the people who are living by themselves are really doing it, many of those people are doing it very, very hard at the moment. I understand the state government's indicated that they may change the rules to allow people living alone to have one person, but I mean, I haven't heard that confirmed, but I've heard, I think Daniel Andrews or the Chief Health Officer talked about that last week. I think that would be a very positive move. I think the public health risks of that, I'll leave the public health experts to talk about that. But I think for those of us that are fortunate to have company on tap, I think there's also an opportunity for us to think about how do we want to be in reaching out and connecting with people who are in our networks who are living alone, whether that's our friends, our family members, or maybe it might be the neighbour over the fence who we can hang over the fence and have a chat to, or drop a text to, or leave them, let them know we're doing, let them know they're not alone. But I think you've highlighted the group that's got particular challenges and particular risks, Tony.
Very true, Steve. I welcome questions from the floor, and there are a couple coming through as we speak. One question, just a broad question, Steve. If people are really struggling with their mental health, what or who would be the first point of call for them? Where could they reach out? What would you recommend there?
I think depending on the severity of how much people are struggling, I guess if you've got a regular GP, that's always a good place to start. They can provide with what's called a mental health care plan, which refers you on to a mental health professional. So I do some private practice counselling, and that's where most of our work comes from referrals from GPs. I think if it's more immediate and you need to speak to someone immediately, I would recommend the Beyond Blue COVID support line, which I don't have the number in front of me, but I will provide that to you, or Lifeline as well, which is 13 11 14, which and those services do a mountain of fantastic work. I think they'd be the places to start in terms of reaching out. I guess the question, Tony, is always when someone's struggling, like the first the point I would always make is, for most of us when we're struggling, the first people we want to go to is people we know and people we've already got existing relationships with. So that would be our friends, our family, our colleagues, okay? Because we've got existing relationships. We don't have to build a relationship, or people know some of our stories and we can build on that relationship. So I think that's always the starting point. And of course, there's always times where people need more than that and they might need some professional assistance. So there's the 24/7 services such as the Beyond Blue COVID line and Lifeline. There's and then your GP is normally the best way to link if you're wanting to link to with a mental health professional.
Just as a matter of interest, who do you call on a support network yourself? Do you have people close that you turn to for assistance, or do you self-diagnose and self-treat?
Definitely call on others, Tony. I think I guess we all do a bit of I guess we'd call it noticing what we're going through. But like, I'm lucky; I've got a fantastic wife, I've got a fantastic daughter who's got a fantastic partner. I think, and I've got great siblings. One of them who's worked the Year 12 Dean or some such title at Parade, and terrific friends. I guess professionally, in our work, it's really important that we're well supported and connected. So, like, I've got a supervisor who I meet with monthly. I'm meeting with him later today. I've got a sort of network of colleagues, and there's one guy who works in the same practice as me. At the moment, we catch up most Fridays for an hour and sort of catch up with where we're at professionally and personally. Because I guess one of the challenges in the work we do is you've obviously got to you're dealing and talking with some distressed and people, is that you have to maintain your own wellness and stuff. So. And look, I think that thing around, reaching out can be very difficult. Like, I think I've mentioned my journey to psychology. A really important part of that was seeing a therapist. And when I did that in my late 20s, like, I didn't know anyone. None of my friends or family members had ever told me they'd been to a therapist. It was a really massive step in those days. There was a massive stigma around mental health. And there still is some stigma around mental health, but fortunately, it's changed. And we look at the young people coming through, and mental health is discussed in schools now, which is fantastic. I think we've still got a way to go in these areas, but I think this thing that we, the general principle is the more we keep it in and don't reach out, generally the worse it gets. Choosing trusted others or reaching out to professionals, it's not a magic wand, to use that term again, but it certainly at least connects us.
Steve, before we wind up, I will offer the opportunity to other people watching on, if they'd like to send through a question very quickly. Steve will address it. But one question I'd like to put to you, Steve, is, and I mentioned how I felt a bit earlier, one of the other areas I think does have to say tinker with your mind somewhat is the fear of the unknown. In other words, trying to work out how this is going to end, when this is going to end, and what will it look like. How does one deal with that, the anxiety of the unknown, of not knowing what's around the corner?
You're asking some excellent questions, Tony. It seems like you might have done, you've done this job before, haven't you? Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. I guess we talked about things feeling sort of out of control, and this anxiety that we feel because we don't know what's going to happen and what next, we don't know what next week's going to look like, let alone next month or next year or next decade. And look, again, I think we use the same sort of principle and approach, which is, if we think about anxiety as a human emotion, it's a really normal human emotion. If we think about when we've sat an exam or a job interview or a first date or a difficult interaction with someone, we experience anxiety. And mostly because the things that we're about to do are important to us. So it's really, I think it's worth noting that anxiety is a really normal human emotion, and it tends to show up when we do things that are important. I think the other part that's really important about what you say is, again, we bring it back to acknowledging that it's there and that it's difficult, and bringing it back to what is it that I can control right now. I mean, I can't do anything at a personal level about a vaccine. Nothing, okay? Absolutely nothing. But when I go out for a walk later today, I can wear a mask, okay? When I finish this session and I make a couple of phone calls, I can choose how I am in those phone calls with those people. And I guess many of us will have found ourselves occasionally sort of distracted or caught up or pushed around by that anxiety, and maybe not being how we really would like to be our sort of best or ideal selves with our partners or our children or our colleagues, because we're sort of hooked up in that anxiety and those things that might happen in the future. So it's really normal and natural that we worry. And what we're trying to do is acknowledge that, but not get so caught up in it that we lose connection with right now and how we want to be right now. Because how we want to be right in this moment, I think one of the things we've learned through COVID, there's a whole lot less stuff that we can control that we really thought. But what we can really control is this moment. In a way, if we really bring it down to a really simple level, that's what we can control, nothing else. We think we can control what we're going to do in an hour, but things happen. If that storm had blown in at 11:25, guess what we wouldn't be doing now? We wouldn't be able to connect in this way. So there's a whole lot of things outside of our control. Yes, they're certainly of concern, and they can be really overwhelming sometimes. And we need to keep bringing it back to, how do I want to be right now? What's important right now? How do I want to treat other people? How do I want to treat myself? How do I want to treat my body right now?
Steve, I think it's a really great place to end today's webinar. I'd really like to thank you on behalf of all the viewers that have tuned in this morning. I'd like to thank you for taking us through all those insights and little tips, that small things that can really make a huge difference. I think in the course of the past 50 minutes, I certainly feel better now, having gone through the process and and taken a bit away about how to deal with these strange times in which we all live. So I'd sincerely like to thank you. I'm going away now to drop anchor, and I'm hoping that everyone else that have viewed the webinar today will do the same. Tenete traditione, Steve. Thanks again. We'll see you soon. Stay well. And
thanks.
Watching on today, please look after yourselves. We'll get through this. We're all in together. A hackneyed cliche, I know, but it is so true. And Steve, thanks again. It's been magnificent to glean your thoughts and advice today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tony, and thanks very much, Kylie, for your assistance. Thanks very much for attending. And look, I'll send some resources through. And I guess the other point, that it's really helpful to laugh sometimes when there's really difficult times. There's times where that isn't appropriate, or when there's tragedy and things where that's not going to be possible or appropriate. But those small moments we can capture in terms of that are fantastic. Thanks very much, everyone, and please stay safe and well, and all the best.
Thanks, Steve. Bye-bye,
well
everyone.
Well done, Steve.
Bye.
Bye, Don.
Thanks, Steve.
All the best.
Thanks, Tony. See you, mate. Cheers.
Bye-bye.